The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our September web tips for Winshuttle. I want to welcome everyone. If this is the first time that you've been to our tips and tricks session, I want to just kind of set some expectations that we have a lot of people from various backgrounds. This web tips session for the month of September is going to focus on the workflow tool. So if you're here for that, you're in the right spot. And just to get started, if you have any questions, everyone's currently on mute. Go ahead and type those into the chat window. That will alert me that you have some questions, and we can stop, and I can either unmute everyone at the end, or I can answer your questions specifically there. Getting started, a quick introduction about myself. I'm the CTO and founder here at Clear Process Solution. I'm a software and a Winshuttle architect. For the past 14 years, I've been dealing with a lot of different technology. So, you know, as a CTO of our company, I really love technology. If you don't love technology, you probably shouldn't be a CTO. And I dabble in a lot of different systems, from SAP and Winshuttle to CRM systems. I deal a lot with SQL and SharePoint programming, virtual servers, and security. So I love technology. I'm glad that I get to present this unique topic on state-based workflows here today with Composer, because, you know, it's not really something that you say, oh, I can click on state-based workflow in Composer and know exactly what it is. It's kind of a concept that we put together here at CPS when we're designing very complex workflows. So my objective today will be to give you the template, the blueprint on how you can start to design workflows for very complicated workflows for using state-based. We'll talk about the other different types of workflows as we define what a state-based workflow is. We really need to understand what are our other options when designing workflows. And then lastly, we're going to do a demo. So you can actually see a state-based workflow in action. I've kind of got it pre-set up and configured that we can actually talk about it, so you don't have to see me draw little pictures and take time on that you can actually see a state-based workflow in action and kind of talk about the different core components around the form and the workflow when it comes to designing that inside of Composer. And lastly, we'll take any of your questions. So the first thing we need to define is what is a state-based workflow, or what are state-based workflows. So, you know, looking at Microsoft's term, when I started doing workflow and business process improvement, one of the first tools I used was actually Microsoft Tools, and it was using Visual Studio, and it was creating custom code in C#. And Microsoft really had two real different workflow platforms that you can use and create. There were these sequential based workflows, and then there was these things called state machines. So with Microsoft's terminology, it's more of modeling style, which you can model workflows in an event driven manner. So based on a given event, allow your workflow to be manipulated and changed in different paths. They have these containers that allow you to do certain activity within each container, and then you can use those containers and activities in other different areas of your workflow to switch it back and forward between different states. Kind of complicated, you know, pulled that from Microsoft as their, you know, kind of terminology of what they're saying a state-based workflow is. Now, with my terminology, just keeping it very simple, is given a state, allow the workflow to change as the business process changes. In creating complex workflows, there are far more unpredictable paths that a user can take, but designing with the state in mind, your workflow will be easier to manage. So when you look at your workflows and the complex business processes that we can develop with inside of Winshuttle Composer, using a state-based workflow approach will allow you to manage your workflow in a more simplistic and easier fashion. And we'll kind of see that through the demo today. We only have 3 different states in our demo, but you can imagine if there was 20 or 50 different states in a workflow, what that would be. And when I say state, states are different parts of your business process and different paths or in different activities. So as we do our demo today, we're talking about a material process. So when we talk about a material process, a material can be in several states. It can be in a make state, which means we're going to make this material. It could manufacture it, and it can go through our manufacturing team, or it could be in a purchase state, and with the purchase state, we're actually going to purchase the part. But as all business is not predictable, and things in our business change, sometimes when we want to go purchase a part, we find that the cost is too high to purchase it, so we're just going to decide to make the part instead. So to be able to go from a purchase part to a make part and designing your typical workflow structure is very hard to diagram out. And even on the same side of the house, if you make the part, you decide you're going to make it, and then your machines break down within your plants, you decide you want to go ahead and put that over to be purchased. To be able to do that within your workflow, again, would be hard. And when I say, in my definition here, that for complex workflows that are far more unpredictable as far as the paths go, you don't really know what happens in the business and when. You can't predict when there's going to be a disaster. You can't predict when a machine's going to go down. So having to model that in a typical sequential parallel nature is a little bit complicated. So if you raise it up a level, and that's what I consider state-based workflows, is raising it up a level and understanding your process in different states, then you can model something that's a little bit easier and allow your process to do that. So the question is next is, how do we do that, and what are our different types of workflows? So looking at the far left here, with a sequential-based workflow, it's a very simple path. It goes from task 1 to task 2 to task 3. Very sequential in nature. There's no going back. It's just going down through a typical business process. So when you think of a timesheet approval can be a very sequential-based process that an employee submits their timesheet. It goes to the manager for approval. After the manager approves it, it goes to HR for approval, and then eventually the process will end. So that's very sequential in nature, and it will just follow a typical path and a predictable path. With a parallel-based process, it's very similar to sequential, except we want more activities to happen at the same time to maybe speed up our business process. But eventually, there's going to be a split in your workflow. And with Winshuttle, you can split your workflow, come back together, then split it apart again. So you can process in sequential and parallel. So if we look at task 1 under parallel, that's our first task. But once that activity is completed, we'll say that's our MDM team to create our basic material setup. Once they are done with their task, then it splits out to many more teams: the engineering team, maybe the sales team, the marketing team, to provide additional data on your material. And then lastly, with the parallel, you always have it coming back together, or to end your workflow, to end your process. Maybe task 4 is the last task in our system, is for the originator to review this information in your ERP system. Maybe it's SAP or JD Edwards, some type of system you're looking to verify, yeah, everything looks like it was set up correctly. Moving over to our state-based, really what we do with our state-based is we raise it up a level out of sequential and parallel, and we think about our process as given states. So we could have a make state, we can have a purchase state, we can have a costing state, we can have a state that just says this is the complete state. When we determine that everything is done, then go ahead and send it to the complete state. We can have a revised state, so a state that says, something happened somewhere at some point in time. We need the originator to make modifications to this, so send it back to the revised state. So you think of this more as in state-based around your process versus task-based in a flow. Now, what you'll see in our demonstration today is that when we have these state-based concepts, we still have sequential and parallel inside of those states. So it's not like you're developing sequential and parallel or state. Actually, state is using sequential and parallels within the given states. We're just raising our methodology up and our business process up a little bit higher, so that if new states come on within our business process, currently we're just doing make, but now we decide we're going to, with this material creation process, we're also going to bring on purchase parts. Or maybe we start out with a semi-finished materials in our system, and we develop this workflow in the states around semi-finished, but then we decide, well, let's bring on finished goods. And with finished goods, we need all these new states. So with being able to develop in states, it gives you the capability to move and add on to your workflow as the business changes, as your process changes, and you can continue to think and do things a little bit easier versus a lot of cutting and pasting if you were designing in this sequential / parallel nature, and your workflows get really big and hard to manage. At the end of the state, we always have this process down here that we want to make sure we determine, given the state it was in, maybe it was in the complete state, and then we say, yeah, it's ready to end, go ahead and end the process. You always want to have a decision at the end for your state so that you don't continually repeat this state multiple times. You have to have a way to get out of your state. But if the process wasn't ended, and the answer is no, then we come back up, and maybe we were in state 1 and we want to jump over to state 3 for our next part of our business process, or maybe we're in state 3 and we need to go back to state 2. What's nice with developing state-based workflows is that there's no right or wrong path, and there's no saying, well, you've already gone so far down the path, you can't go backwards. With state-based workflows, you can go back as many times as you want. You can go from 1 to 3 to 2 to 3. So as I said in my definition, it is very unpredictable, the paths that maybe users will follow or want to follow or the business will follow, but designing your workflows in this manner makes it very flexible on your side to be able to update your workflow as you see fit. Next, we'll go ahead and start talking about how these concepts relate to Winshuttle, and we'll go ahead and jump over to Composer here. So in Composer, we have our Solution tab, our Workflow tab, and our Form tab. So the first thing we're going to look at is our Form tab here, and just kind of talk about the basic constructs of a state-based workflow. So obviously, when you have a form in a business process, you have multiple views, and you have a lot more fields than this. You're probably going to have hundreds of fields on your form. Really, the only fields we need from a state-based workflow perspective are the 3 fields I have down here. So we have our status field, our next state field, and our previous state. So I've just created fields on the form so that we can see them. You can certainly delete this and hide it, but from a demo perspective, it'll be really nice to kind of walk through the state-based workflow and see your different values update as we go throughout the state. I did put some request information up top here so we can actually see who the name of the requester is and the request date. And then we're using our procurement type, as this being a state-based workflow for materials. We're using our procurement type here to derive where do we go first. Is this a make part or is this a purchase part? And then given that, our state will be set. So we have one very simple rule that we'll use, and we'll see that we can change this as we go through it. But this rule on this drop down is simply saying set the state equal to whatever is currently in the drop down. So if make is in the drop down, then set this next state to make. If purchase is in the drop down, set the next state to make. We use the workflow itself to determine the previous state. So once we're in a state, let the workflow set the previous state, and we'll see that when we review the workflow. But this next state here is really what drives our workflow in our form. So now that we know what's on the form, very simple form, no other really rules or anything like that, we'll jump over to our workflow. So starting with our workflow, we have a very simple start process. And if you've been on past WEBtips, our WEBtips, what we always say is a CPS best practice is to always have a start, a main, and an end. And the main is just a Winshuttle composer loop that has a repeat condition, or if you want to set the repeat condition to none, you can certainly do that as well. But with this main here, we always recommend that you don't do any of your real workflow diagramming out on what we call the process loop. So the name of your process or the name of your form is called state-based workflow. So we recommend never doing any development of your workflow on top of that. Always put it in a loop and always do your development there. In the case of our process here, we're simply going to set the status to in progress. So we'll see it go from not submitted to in progress. We'll then go in our main, and then we'll set our process to complete when we're done with the main. Now, when you're setting up and configuring a state-based workflow, as we saw on the PowerPoint presentation, at the end it asked, "Are you done? Are you finished?" So in our case, we are looking at the field called next state and making sure it is equal to complete. If the next state is equal to complete, then we end. And that's how we exit our main loop here so that we can go on the rest of our workflow, in this case, just setting it to complete. Looking at our main workflow here, this is really when we get to the constructs of the state and the decision that we saw earlier. So the first thing we do in a state-based workflow is make a decision on which state are we in. So we're using the next state field, and the next state field will say if the next state is equal to make, then go ahead and go to our manufacturing state. If our next state equals purchase, then go ahead and go to our purchasing loop here. And lastly, if our next state is costing, then we're going to go to our costing state. So each one of these states represent different business processes, different things that we may have to involve different people. And they could be parallel or sequential inside of those. But these are given states, and at a high level, what we're looking at from a material process. And as I said earlier, we can have another state called complete. In our case here, we're really doing our complete step inside of the costing, and we'll see that in a second. But with any workflow, once you're done, if we look at these states here, our manufacturing state, you can see our loop type is none. We don't want, in a state-based workflow, we don't want to repeat until inside of a loop. We want to say, this is the state. Once it's done and completed, it needs to exit, come down the OR path, exit, and then it needs to look at the condition of the main loop. In this case, it would say, is the next state equal to complete? And if it's not, then to go to this start node again and decision and start all over again. What this is giving us is the capability of going from manufacturing to costing, or costing back to purchasing, purchasing to costing, and any different path that we really want to allow for our users to choose. You know, when those disasters happen, when a machine shuts down in a manufacturing site, that we can go ahead and ship it over to purchasing. Looking at our manufacturing loop, we'll just dive into this one. We have a very simple workflow here that just goes to the start. It tells our manufacturing team to go ahead and make the part, and then they have really two options here. They can approve it, which will set the next state to costing. So how do we get from our make state to costing? Well, we're using a value setter, and we're setting the value of next state equal to costing. And then what you'll also notice is we're setting the previous state to make. This is the only time you'll ever see previous state being set is in the workflow, because it's telling us where you came from. And that's important when we get to the costing state, and we'll look at the costing state where we're actually using this previous state here in a second. But we set the next state to costing, and then we exit. We hit our OR node and we end. If it is rejected, if the manufacturing team says, you know, we can't really make this, then we're going to go to a value setter that's going to change the next state to purchase. So again, if that disaster happens, the machine shuts down, or it's just too costly to make, maybe we'd rather purchase it, it's cheaper, let's go ahead and set the next state to purchase. Once we are the purchase loop is the same exact construct that you saw on the make loop. So we have purchase and approval, it's going to costing, rejection, it's going back to our make state. And then lastly is our costing state. From the costing state perspective, it's a start and then goes to costing. Now we just have somebody pushing a button for approval. We have designed costings in which we can actually set it up to query SAP to see if a status field has been changed. So if maybe your status goes from OA to blank, then we know the material has been costed, and you have these routines inside of SAP that do that for you. So you can set up costing or set up Winshuttle to actually go look at your ERP system, and it could be SAP, it could be Epicor, JD Edwards, PeopleSoft, where we can set up Winshuttle to go look at your ERP system for something to happen. And then once that happens, then make a decision on it. So in this case, if it failed costing, then we would want to go back to whatever state that it sent it over to costing. But if you can remember, there's two different paths to get the costing. You can go from the make path, or you can go from the purchase path. So how do we know to go back to the right state? Well, in this case, we use the value setter here. And if we open up the value setter, what we do is we say set next state equal to the previous state. This is why that previous state is so important on a state-based workflow, is that you know how to get back from where you were called from. And so you can see on any given state, you always want to make sure you keep track of where you came from, because there's some times that things failed and we need to go back to where it came from, but there's multiple entry points to get to a single state. So in a complete state, you could come from really 5 or 10 different entry points. So we need to know what called this particular state. So that's where we're using the previous state to actually go backwards in our workflow. If everything was approved and costing did look good, you'll see that this is where it's setting the next state equal to complete. And that's what really the workflow is looking at. Once we hit our OR node and our end, it's going to check first the condition of this loop. The condition of this loop is equal to none. So it's going to go ahead and exit this loop and go to the parent loop, which happens to be the main. So the main, we see costing is right here. We go to the OR and hit an end. As I discuss in any of our training classes that we conduct at CPS, is once you hit an end node of a loop, then you're going to evaluate the condition of that loop to decide whether you go back to the start or you end and go up to the next level. So in this case, we're hitting the end of the loop, and our next state is going to equal complete, which is a true condition. So therefore, we're allowed to exit our main loop. So now we're back up to our process loop. And once we're at our process loop, we are in this main loop right here. So now we can go forward. We're going to set the status to complete, and then we're going to end the workflow. Now that we've kind of seen the overview of how to set up and configure a state-based workflow, looking at Winshuttle and how we would set it up with loops and our approvals and rejection paths and setting the next state, the previous state. Now let's just go set it in action. So we'll go ahead and launch our form here. All right, so we have our requester information, Justin, our date. We have our procurement type blank. We have our status not submitted, and our next and previous state as blank as well. So we're going to go ahead and change our procurement type to make, because we're deciding we're going to make this, and we'll go ahead and hit save and route. Now once we hit save and route, our expectation is that this is actually going to go down the make state because our type there was make. And then we have a task on our task list here for our workflow. Let's switch over to here so we can see the name. So the task name says make part, and this is from our state-based workflow, and we have our date here at 11:25, and it's been processing for 12 seconds. So if we go back to our workflow and we look at our manufacturing state here, we see that there's a task called make part assigned to this team. So that's exactly where we're located right now. So we can really choose whatever path we want. Let's go ahead and go down our approval path first, and then we'll actually flip it back here, and we'll do a couple different paths that you may not have expected from this workflow. So we're at make, and we're going to go ahead and say, well, we're going to approve this, which is going to set our next state to costing. So if I look at the set value here, when we approve it, our next state is going to equal costing, and our previous state is going to equal make. So let's see what the form looks like as we do that. Okay, so looking at our form here, we have an in progress. We have our next state is currently make, and our previous state is blank. We're going to go ahead and click approve. And this will send it down our costing path, as we said, and then as we also said, our previous state should be filled in. So if I go ahead and click on this task name as costing, now we have our next state equal to costing, and our previous state is make, which is really important here because we're actually going to say that it failed costing. So when we say it failed costing, looking at our costing loop here, it tells us when it rejects failed costing, send it back to where you came from. In this case, it was our make state, so we'd expect it to go back to me. So I'm going to go ahead and click on reject. And now we have our task back at make part, which is exactly what we wanted it to do. So with it on our make part, we have the same exact functionality as we saw before on the make, but then this time, let's say we can't make it, our machine shut down in our plant, we need to purchase it. So by rejecting it, now it's going to go to our purchase part. So now we have our task here called purchase part, and then we have the same options on purchase as we did previously. So we have our next state set as purchase, or previous as make, and then we can go ahead and click approve here, which will send it down our costing path. So if we click on our workflow here and we look at approve, it sets the status equal to costing, the next state equal to costing, and then the previous state equal to purchase. Back to our workflow step. Now we have costing again, so we're reusing that same costing state. However, we can send it back to where it came from, so we can also say at this time it failed costing as well. And so you wouldn't have expect, we go from make to failed costing, back to make, and now we're back to purchasing again to purchase the part. So we have all of these different iterations of these different states, and you can go through and approve each one of these or reject each one and go and kind of map out on a test matrix all of the different paths that users can take and all the things that you should test, but you can really focus your testing. I can focus my testing on, well, I want to test the costing state, and there's only two different approves and rejection points, and I need to be able to go back to each of our entry points. So with this last costing here, we're going to go ahead and just click approve, which is going to end our workflow. And once our workflow ends here, we'll go ahead and look at our form. State-based workflow, and we'll choose our 1125 entry here. Let's just look at all of the process history that ended up taking from all of our actions that we took. So we went from start to make to costing, back to make, back to purchasing, back to costing, back to purchasing, to costing, and then finally, after costing was approved, which means we actually had the material costed in SAP, we're able to end our workflow. So this is just a very simplistic version of a workflow that shows you how to set up the state-based workflow. And some people may say, well, can you show me what it would look like if we were to do all of this in a non-state-based workflow? And what I would say is it would probably take me 10 times as long to set that up than to just set it up this way, because of all of the back and forth paths and the paths that you would have to draw. You would have to have nested loops within loops within loops just to try to do something like this. So everyone that's on the call today, as you're looking through this and how to set it up and configure, you can take the same business requirements that we have here and saying, need to be able to go from a make to a purchase and from costing the previous, go ahead and try to set up something and see how your workflow would end up given that versus a very simple approach to looking at it in a state-based workflow. Okay, next I'm going to go ahead and flip back to our deck here, and we'll take a look at any questions that you may have. So I'm going to go ahead and look at our questions. If there's something specific that you want to see and me to model real time, I can do that from a workflow perspective. If there's something that you had a question about the state, go ahead and type your questions now. Okay. All right. So I'll give it a couple more minutes. As I'm talking through this, we'll see if there are any other questions on workflows, state-based workflows. Again, we can look at what we saw there with sequential, parallel, and state. So if you have any other questions on that, please feel free to type them in. Otherwise, we'll talk about our upcoming events. So we have an event in October 26th that we're going to have our Ohio WUG event that's being held in the Twinsburg area at the B-Tram Inn. And then following that Ohio WUG event that's from 1 to I think 4 or 5, there's an after party, the Lean Utopia after party at the same exact location that CPS sponsors. We'll also be conducting a complete composer training in Dallas Monday through Friday, November 6th to the 10th. So if you're in the Dallas area or you want to go to the Dallas area, this would be a perfect time to have an understanding of how you start out with a transaction script. So we conduct 2 days of transaction script training on both transaction and query. So you're going to use the desktop tools of desktop tools of Winshuttle to learn how to push and pull data out of SAP. And then you're going to take those same transaction scripts that you used on day 1 and 2, and you're going to use those to integrate with a composer form and workflow. So we take that beginning day knowledge and then we put it into a form and workflow. So if you've never done form and workflows, it's a great opportunity to learn form and workflows. If you've never taken a process from the design side of it all the way to the end in Composer, another great opportunity to come to a 5-day class to really focus in. We talk about a lot of things like this, state-based workflows, in the last class that we held here in Ohio. We talked about state-based workflows as part of the workflow composer form and workflow side, and we just also discussed a lot of best practices, tips, and tricks that we've learned in our experience in developing forms and workflows. So if you haven't registered for that event, you can find it on our website at clearprocesssolutions.com to get there. Lastly, our web tips, the recordings will be found on YouTube. If you do have certain suggestions on web tips or have questions or want something, a deck or maybe a solution, you can email WEBtips at clearprocesssolutions.com for any suggestions or tips when you're talking to us. And lastly, if you are a SolutionCare customer, great, and there are a lot of accelerators that we released at the WUG event around smart forms and smart monitoring, and those are all coming with the SolutionCare offering. We will actually monitor your Winshuttle environment in like a robotic process automation way, in which you won't have to worry about things like background jobs failing or your server space filling up. we actually have created these Winshuttle jobs that will monitor that for you so that you can focus more on the forms and workflow side instead of the admin side of Winshuttle. So those are coming with, so those are available for SolutionCare customers. If you're not a SolutionCare customer, we are giving away 5 free hours of SolutionCare to start out to see if you like it. If you look at the diagram here, this will be things that you can utilize with the SolutionCare offering, even if it's, you know, augmenting your team to do transaction development, or it may be setting up architectural reviews and best practices, or help debugging an error or an issue that you have. All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to our web tips for September. Hopefully, you learned a little bit on state-based workflows. If you have any questions, please feel free to email our web tips at clearprocesssolutions.com. Thank you.